everyone. Last year, the Sarasota Music Archive launched a new jazz series. It was very well received, and so we're continuing with one this year. It's called Jazz in the Making, and Harry Miedema, who's a member of our board, oversees the series. He's going to give the first presentation this year, which is entitled, "Those Guys Are Just Making That Stuff Up." It's a famous quote by Homer Simpson. Harry explains why there's a lot more that goes into jazz playing than meets the eye. Harry Miedema was a saxophonist and/or the music director for 23 years of the famous OJs. In 1997, he became director of jazz studies at the University of Indianapolis. He instituted an undergraduate degree in jazz studies there. He retired as professor emeritus in 2014. He attended Indiana University, receiving a master's degree in saxophone performance. Here in Sarasota now for several years, he is the leader of the Blue Heron Sextet. We want to thank the Sarasota Friendship Center for the use of their space and for our manager, Dave Berry, at the archive, who has recorded this program. So now please welcome Harry Miedema.
Good day. I'm glad that you're all here and on your side of the screen. We're going to try and explain a little bit today about how jazz works. And jazz during the 1930s and 40s was actually America's popular music. And a sort of a revolution happened during the 1940s owing to a couple of things. One was there was a recording ban in New York, and so no one could make any records. That allowed bebop as a musical style to kind of creep up on us. And it's also when music turned from a popular music to an art music. Art music is music that develops at its own artistic pace with consumption by the masses a secondary consideration. I think we'll play some art music for you right now. I'm sure you know this tune.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, I'm sure you all know that song. It's Take the A Train. But sometimes people are confused about who wrote it and why. Some people think that Duke Ellington wrote it when actually Billy Strayhorn, a young piano player from Pittsburgh, wrote it. He wrote it after meeting Duke Ellington in Pittsburgh, and the Duke said, well, when you come to New York, I'll put you up and take care of you until you can make some money. And immediately, Billy Strayhorn wrote the tune A-Train so he could remember how to get to Duke's place. It's the quickest way to get to Harlem. That was the A-Train. Well, the English language and jazz are about the same thing. We have syntax, correct usage of words. When it's written, we have written rules about English, and we have written rules about music. And it turns out that in order to be eloquent when we speak and to say exactly what we mean, we need to have a pretty good vocabulary. I always liked the newscasters when I was a youngster. Walter Cronkite always seemed to speak fluently and not speak above people's heads, but used language very well and understood it. Jazz players, likewise, if they're going to play well, they need to have some musical words and understand their meaning and know how to put them together. And one of the things that they must know is how to deal with scales. If I play a scale straight up and down, that's called conjunct motion. Conjunct is a word which means notes which are next to each other on the piano keyboard. Well, it would be dull to hear nothing but conjunct scales as a solo. So I need to be able to come up with a scale pattern that allows me to play in a disjunct manner, or play the notes not next to each other. I could simply play a scale in thirds. And if you listen to jazz long enough, you'll certainly hear somebody play that musical pattern on a scale. If I dissect that scale in thirds and break it down into two-note groups, I get well, if I turn every other two-note group around and play it in the opposite direction, then I get and now the scale, which started out being conjunct and easy to understand, is starting to become a little more complicated, but fun to listen to. So scales and scale patterns are just a must for jazz players to know. I might also say that it's not enough to know them in 4 keys, but we have to know them in all 12 keys. So when I practice scales, I like playing them all at the same time. So forth and so on. And it forces me to play all of the keys, what kids call the easy keys and the hard keys, next to each other. So that's scales. Well, there's another thing that jazz players use, another word that they learn, and it's called a cliché, or a 2-5 lick. And an example of that might be and I can use that lick anytime I see a certain chord sequence in the tune. Well, it turns out there are a lot of those chord sequences in the tune A-Train. So let's remember the pattern. Let's see if I can make that work for me in the tune A-Train. Now, once again, it would be kind of boring if all I did was play 2/5 patterns or cliches. But they're another part of the musical language, musical words, that allow me to put sentences together and make a melodic statement. One other thing I might do is use chord substitutions. That gets to be a little deep. Chord substitutions. There are some rules about when you may not play a chord that's written and instead play a different chord. But if I played a chord substitution on that lick, the original lick would sound like. But if I used a substitution, it might sound like. Chord substitutions are extremely frequent. You find players leaning on chord substitutions in order to make their musical statement. Let me try playing A Train again, and let me see if I can't use more chord substitutions. And you'll know I play them when I play notes that sound a bit odd for the key that we're in. Let's try it. At the very end of my solo, I played a chord substitution which allowed me to play a familiar melody to you, but in two different keys, one right after the other. I played, and next I played, and I resolved it. So altogether, the phrase I played sounds like, which is kind of a fun little phrase to play, and it sounds interesting. Well, those are words. There's one other thing that jazz players do, and it's an occasional thing, it doesn't get overused, but it's called tune quoting. And it means I can play the melody to a tune that I'm not playing, but it will fit with the chords. Let me see if I can quote a couple of tunes for you in A Train. Well, Jerry Coker wrote a book, which is quite a good book, called Listening to Jazz. And it explains much of the things that we are talking about today. But an interesting thing that it says at one point is that if we subtracted from a jazz player's solo all of the scales and scale patterns, all of the 2/5 licks and cliches, and all of the tune quotes, and all of the chord substitutions, what would be left would be the real creativity part of his or her solo. And Jerry Coker estimated that to be probably 0 to 20% in most cases. Now, there are certainly times when I listen to Miles Davis or Cannonball Adderley or John Coltrane, And I can tell for a fact that they're not doing any of the things that we've discussed. They're being extremely creative. But there are very few players who can rely strictly on their creativity to get them through solos night after night and tune after tune. So, the next thing we need to talk about is what we're going to base our playing on, or the vehicle, the tune that we're going to play. And tunes have some variables which either make the tune easier or more difficult, or more attractive or less attractive. The first is tempo. And so a song can be either fast or slow, or somewhere in between. The chord progression can be familiar, or it can be very unfamiliar. Well, the chord progression to A Train is very familiar, which allows me to play other very familiar songs and quote them on top of the melody to A Train. There are tunes, however, where the chord progressions are extremely unfamiliar, and John Coltrane is responsible for writing some of those songs. They're very difficult and require a good deal of practice before performing them. So the chords could be either simple or complex. The chord progression can be easy or familiar or not familiar. And when we put all of those things together, we can describe any particular tune with those aspects of music in mind. I'm going to play right now, we're going to look at various vehicles. And the first one I'm going to demonstrate for you is called a modal tune. And it's a modal tune because it stays within one scale or one chord for an extended length of time. So there's very little harmonic motion in a modal tune. It's pretty much tells me that I can't play 2 5 licks because the chords in my modal tune aren't going anywhere. And 2 5 licks tend to want to take us someplace. So I have to rely on scale patterns, and I could play off of the melody of the song. Let's see what I can do with this. This is a song, a composition of John Coltrane's. It's called Impressions, and it has 2 chords. One chord lasts 16 bars, then it goes up a half step for 8 bars, then it comes back to the original chord for 8 bars. So just 2 chords. Let's see.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Modal tunes are not easy, but then music's not. I can't think of a tune that is easy, but it requires you to put your notes together in a much different way in order to satisfy the chord that's going on at the moment and realizing that the chord is not going to move anywhere. That's a modal tune. The next tune we're going to talk about is an American standard tune. And American standard tunes are exemplified by the music of Cole Porter or Irving Berlin or any number of Tin Pan Alley composers. They are driven by harmonic motion. In other words, the fun of the song is not only the melody, but it's how the chords interact with each other. American standard tunes are customarily played at slow to medium fast tempos, but not extremely fast. And many of the songs come from Broadway shows. An example of an American standard tune would be the tune Whispering. And Whispering goes like this.
One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
That's Whispering, a popular song written in 1920. And in order to make sense of it, I mostly want to play 2/5 licks because there are a lot of those in the song. I might quote a tune once in a while. I probably don't need too much to depend on scale patterns. Excuse me. Whispering has moderate to slow harmonic rhythm. That's a term that we previously used and I didn't explain, and I will now. Harmonic rhythm simply means the pace at which we hear new chords. The pace at which we hear new chords. So in American standard tunes, we usually hear a new chord every 1 or 2 bars. Once in a while, we'll hear 2 chords in 1 measure, but that's less common. And so if I improvise on this song, I probably will use a fair amount of chord substitutions because I have more time in which to say them. I'm going to improvise a little bit on Whispering.
One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
And that's Whispering. Now, it turns out that while Cole Porter and his friends were writing Broadway songs and American standard tunes, there was a group of people called beboppers in the 1940s who were trying to transform the music of the 1930s and 40s from dance music to art music. The beboppers wrote new melodies on American standard tunes and turned them into what are called today contrafacts. It's interesting, having taught college, that we need a name for everything, and we need an academic sounding name. Contrafact fills the bill. So a contrafact that's based on the chords to whispering is a tune called Groovin' High. And what I'm going to do is play the melody in the first half of the tune to whispering, and in the second half of the tune, I'll play the melody to Groovin' High, and you'll see that they both fit the chords.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
So we can see both of those melodies fit the same chord progression. A contrafact, it's called. And there are tons of contrafacts based on the original song, I Got Rhythm. Literally hundreds of contrafacts were written on I Got Rhythm. And our next tune to talk about, the 12-bar blues. The 12-bar blues comes from a wide variety of sources, mostly in the southern United States. And in jazz, the form of the blues got boiled down to a 12-bar progression, which is extremely plastic. It's moldable. It can be changed without changing the character of the blues. It can be added to or subtracted from and substituted for, and it will remain a 12-bar blues. I'm going to play you the 12-bar blues progression, and I'll play a melody of Duke Ellington's called C-Jam Blues, which is interesting because the tune's in B flat.
2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
That's the 12-bar blues. So there are other tune types that we did not discuss today, but we don't hear them in this area, and we don't hear them in most of the United States, except for extremely large cities like Chicago or New York or LA. One of those would be a free tune. And a free tune is exactly the way it sounds. There's not a fixed chord progression. The tune is not a definite length, and you don't have to play based on the chords. if you don't feel like it. And consequently, in this area, lots of people hear jazz when they go out to dinner. They probably don't want to listen to a lot of free tunes. They'd rather hear American standard tunes. Well, we've talked about words that jazz players use, and we've also talked about how they put them together and use them in tunes. We've talked about the kinds of tunes that players play. And lastly, we're going to talk about approaches to tunes that jazz players use. In other words, there are sort of more or less 6 different ways of playing a tune, some of which we've talked about. The first one on the list is scale patterns. I can say to myself ahead of time, I'm going to start out with some scale patterns on this tune because that's what the chord changes are asking me for.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Another way that we can approach starting our solo is to play off of the melody. Could we go back to whispering? And I'll use the melody to start my solo.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
That's kind of an interesting way to start a solo. As I continue further through the solo, I can find myself getting further away from the melody and more into some other approach. Another approach that people use is called common tones. and it's kind of self-explanatory. I'll find a note which is copacetic with several chords in a row, and then I'll make sure that you understand I intend to play it on all of the chords. Let's see if I can make that work. Common tones.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
A way that I tend to play quite a bit is I like playing with harmony. So I use a lot of chord substitutions and 2/5 licks. And let's play, we'll stick with that whispering.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. That is using licks. There's one other way that's challenging and fun, and that is to have a theme. And a theme is just something made up with a few notes. I'm going to take at random 3 notes. I'll play E, A, and G. And I'm going to use that as a theme and see if I can vary it and make music out of it. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
So, what I'd like to do now, first of all, is thank you all for watching me today on the silver screen. I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk to you and talk a little bit about jazz. I'm going to finish the afternoon by playing on the blues and let you figure out what I'm doing. What approaches am I using here and there? Here we go.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
thank you all very much. I appreciate having the opportunity to play for you. And I hope I eventually see us all at a jazz club someplace in the area. Thank you.
Jazz. Pfft, they just make it up as they go along. I could do that.